Okay, before I get started, I'm going to ask everyone to be sure you have a piece of paper and a pen or a computer or something that you can write on, because this is a workshop and we're going to put you in the position of our students. So, our students are never prepared. They don't have pens and papers, so I'm hoping that we're not going to face that here. So, what we want to talk to you about today is the insights that we've gleaned from a large first-year team talk module that Diana and I are on. We launched this 2 years ago, and we think that this can serve as a model for promoting global understanding, diversity, and critical reflection in undergraduate teaching. So what we want to do is to demonstrate what this module does by putting you all in the position of students. So we've got the pen and paper, and before we get going to tell you a bit more about the module and what we do, I'd like to do a little exercise that gives you an idea of, well, what we do. So, is this going to...
It's slightly counterintuitive, so press the down one.
Oh, the down one? Right.
There we go.
Okay, here we are. This is the module that I'm talking about. It's called His 114, The Global History of the Present. And so just to kick us off, so this is something that we do in the very first lecture for this module, and it's to get students thinking about maps. Actually, Diana does a whole unit of the module on maps, how they were constructed, what they reveal about power, particularly about Europe's position in the world and things like that, the ongoing problem with maps and how they divide the world, those sorts of things. So I start off right at the very beginning by showing maps. Now, if you look at this map, where's Britain? It's right in the middle. Right? Why do you think Britain's right there? Now, hold on a second. Is the world rectangular? The world is a sphere, right? Which means we could actually approach that sphere from any angle. Right? So why is Britain slap dab in the middle of that picture?
If you're through the map, it's from Britain, British Empire.
Exactly, all of these things, right? And this is the view you're used to when you go looking for maps, right? Seeing Britain right there.
Sorry, the centre is Greece.
Actually, it's Africa.
Also, of course, we could say, I'm sure if you look at Britain in comparison to other parts of the world, it looks rather big in comparison to the size it actually is, right? This is an example. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Mercator, isn't
Mercator,
it? Of
yeah.
the Mercator map, which distorts, geography the further away from the equator that you go. So Britain actually looks a lot bigger than it is. So Britain is right there, slap dab in the middle. This is how we encounter in our daily lives maps and our vision of where Britain is in the globe. Now what happens, I'm sorry, it's light in here and it's, we actually could use a few lights down. Can we do that? Yeah. What happens if we look at the world from a different perspective? Where is Britain? Really, really hard to spot, isn't it? In fact, I don't have my pointy thing in which I can just sort of pick it out there. But suddenly it's like it's disappeared. Right? And what's in the middle? Here we get a far different perspective. We've got Asia, right? Central China. We've got China, right? One of the fascinating things about China, of course, is that in China, all the maps have China in the middle. And why wouldn't they? Right? Right. So what we start to ask is, what does it do to your thinking about the world to look at a map like this versus a map, the first map that I showed you?
Disorientation.
It disorients you. Does it make you start to think a little bit different about geography and power and where we sit in the world? A little bit? Yeah. in your daily life. Maybe you do. But, right, so the idea here is to think, well, actually, we look at the world in a particular way, we have particular worldviews, they're very Eurocentric, they come to us through histories of empire, colonialism, and all the power structures that carried with it, and that we're still living with these legacies. So we start off with the maps and get students thinking about this. And Diana will talk to you a bit more about this in a minute, because we have students write critical journals, and we see their reactions in the journals, which are, oh, I had no idea. Like, you know, just that sheer act of making them think differently about how they approach the world in their daily lives has had quite dramatic impact. So this is just to get us going. To talk a bit more about what we do in the module. So what we do then is we seek to transcend national and temporal frameworks to explore the connections between the global present and the global past. And what we do in the module is we try to do this through study not major events, you know, the sort of stuff you studied in history at school, which is the sort of stuff Diana and I don't do. I don't really care what my students know about dates, but I do care what they know about thinking about connections between peoples in the past and how they worked. Right? We're interested in the nature of interactions between peoples in different parts of the world. So in other words, the ways they came into contact with each other, of the types of exchanges that took place, of studying the world, in other words, as an interconnected system, which is what it is however we flip this map. And we focus in particular on 6 key issues in the world, and we trace their historical antecedents, in addition to assigning students a range of contemporary and historical primary and secondary sources. So we give them a whole load of things. Contemporary newspaper articles along with historical ones, government documents, they look at poems, memoirs, maps, as you can see here, speeches, interviews, broadcasts, televised news stories, blog posts, and so on. And the idea of all this different variety of material is to encourage students to reflect on contemporary events through tracing their global genealogies. So we look at things like Brexit, it's one I cover, Brexit and empire, and what are the historical global genealogies of Brexit, for example. We look at things to do with climate change and why it's disproportionately affecting the global south, and again we trace that through empire. So we have 6 key topics that we then encourage students to reflect on in this way that are of contemporary relevance to them. Issues that affect their lives, that they see in the news every day, but actually they know very little about. And so that's what we try to do. So another key aim is to challenge Eurocentrism through essentially provincializing Europe. And you can see with the map, that's immediate that we're doing that with Greece and not just with Britain as well. Right. So, and we want to position Europe not only as part of wider global processes, right? We want to do that as part of our goal, but we also want to encourage critical, authentic assessment. And Diana's going to talk a bit more about what we do there. In addition to including a range of voices from peoples in the global south in the materials that we assign. So we're very conscious of having a really diverse readings, all the materials that we have coming from people with all sorts of different voices. And the fact that the module uses the past to explore the present helps hit this home, because as I tell students in the first lecture, Europe makes up a mere 10% of the current global population. We're 1%. So what do we get by studying that 1%, that bit of plankton, and ignoring the rest of the ocean? And what are the costs of doing that? So we're trying to get students to think big, long-term, and how all of that has shaped issues in their world. And our final aim is not only to expose students to approaches to history that the history curriculum in England and Wales does not expose them to, history of gender, sexuality and the body, for example, environmental history, the history of violence, but also to difficult histories. This is not an easy module in that sense. We give students historical approaches, understandings of the past that they haven't had before. In fact, that much of their education has been militating against, because it's been in nationalist frameworks. So we do this in particular by focusing on issues relating to race and empire. So all of the 6 themes that we explore grapple with the legacies of these in some way. And I'll stop there and I'll hand it over to Diana, because you're in a...
Yeah, if I could just pick up a bit on the maps thing and then go on to the next slide. So, one of the things that we want students to understand from doing this module is that when we ask difficult questions, we're not doing so in order to get them to feel there's a right answer, which is some sense normatively good. I mean, we do happen to think that challenging the global inequalities is a good in itself, but as historians, our job is to bring a critical analysis to that. So we're not trying to teach students, this is how you should be thinking. And this is one of the things they struggle with initially, is we're asking them to do something difficult and asking them to rethink the world, and they end up thinking that we're telling them what to think. So one of the things we do with the maps is something that I would like you to do. Now, unfortunately, you won't have time to engage with all the things that we ask the students to engage with. But what I'm hoping is that you are a group of fairly well-educated people who already know quite a bit about the world and will be able to do this perhaps just from what you already know. So this is to do with the lines on the map in Africa, which is my specialism. I'm sure you're aware that many of the national borders in Africa are straight lines because they were drawn by imperialists and without real attention to the people who were living there. They just carved up Africa as part of the post-Berlin Conference colonial contestations about taking over parts of Africa to consolidate trade advantage. And even where they're not straight lines, they very often cut through polities, cultures that pre-existed the colonial lines. So is that something that you're all reasonably familiar with? You don't have to have deep familiarity with it. So what we ask the students to do is to read a debate between historians of Africa about how you might redraw the map of Africa so that it wouldn't have the problems created by that colonial legacy. So what I'd like you to do now is just in groups of 3, if you can, or a group of some sort, the size is not that important, to just have a conversation amongst yourselves about what you think might be the response to that question. What might be done to the map of Africa that doesn't have the problems that the colonial lines have? So, you just spend a few minutes doing that?
So much migration.
Okay, because our time is limited, I'm going to wind you up on that now. Did you come to any conclusion? No, exactly. Because, and this is because often students think, okay, this is bad, what happened, so there must be a way to fix it. And what they learn from engaging with this exercise is that the global history of the present is profoundly affected by the past, and you can't just put it right. You can't start again. There isn't a ground zero. We have the world that we inherit. And that therefore, what we're doing as historians is not saying, here's a solution. We're saying, let's try to understand the nature of the problems. So that's the kind of the first thing that we're trying to get them to understand, is that by asking them to think differently, we're not telling them how to think. We're not telling them what to think, we're trying to encourage them to think. So if we're going to do that, then we need to get them to begin to think in a profoundly different way about their history, a way that they have never been asked to think about their history. So we do a thought experiment. In fact, we do 2 thought experiments. I may not have time for both, but this is the first one, which is, let us suppose that the 1848 revolutions in Europe just caused Europe to collapse. Europe just became, it lost all of its economic power, and it descended into internal civil war. While China became much more powerful as a global trading power and ended up taking over Europe. So from the middle of the 19th century, Britain is basically taken over by China. And therefore, if you are a nice middle-class British person, like all of you are, and like all of our students are, you know, you come to university, you're being educated, how did you get there? Well, firstly, you will have had all of your schooling in Chinese. You will have basically become very, very familiar with Chinese literature. You will have to have passed an exam, or a whole series of exams, in Chinese in order to get into university. And what's more, those exams are exams based on Chinese history, Chinese culture, Chinese ways of doing things, which you are required to be expert in. At home, your family very probably speaks Chinese. You only speak British when you're talking to English to or Welsh or whatever to the uneducated. All of the infrastructure that has been developed, all those railways and so on that have been developed since the mid-19th century, are all designed to export raw materials from these islands to China. And everything that we import that's manufactured is coming in from China. Okay? So then, what I'd like you to do is just think for a little bit about what that would make you feel about being British or being European, or being, this is a whole European-wide process. So if you, and the majority of our students are from Europe, so we're sort of asking that, so if you're not from Europe, it's going to be slightly different. But assume that you are a British person, how would that make you feel about being British? What would you think that your Britishness was? You've not learned any British history, or very little. You don't speak English very often. You don't read English literature. Everything that you learn at university is oriented towards the things that matter to Chinese universities, and all of your infrastructure is oriented towards China. What makes you British? How do you define your Britishness or your Europeanness? So just spend a few moments just writing down your own thoughts about that, and then share it with the people that you're sitting next to. Okay, yes.
Is that start to talk?
Yeah, by all means, do start to talk to each other. If you've sort of written something down, then talk about what you've written down.
It's a bit like China last century, when the Second World War finished, and China, everything copied Russians system, Russians, everything. And the school, if you're a good student, good schools, key universities, learn Russian is very popular. And Russian design, Russian car, and the building designs small windows because save the heat, save the energy.
Russian classical
If
music
Russian style is fantastic, and people not negative at all.
Yeah.
They said we are rather sibling country, and no problem. A lot of people married together. Man married with a Russian lady, lady married with a Chinese man, no problem. And after the Cold War, everything changed. And people start to study either Japanese or English. And after Chen Mao died, English very popular, and people start to dash to America. And the top university, like the Chinese Cambridge and Oxford, we call it Tsinghua and Beijing University, very top students, all got a scholarship by America.
Yes.
American people, very clever, get hold of all the clever Chinese students in America now. So it's hard to say
and the people now that study English is fantastic.
Yes, so exactly. So where does that leave being Chinese? So the question is, where would this leave being British? So any thoughts on that?
Well, you've basically also just described the history of Ireland. You know, I mean, I didn't find that particularly difficult to imagine because that's basically what happened in Ireland. You know, our language was pretty much erased. Most of the history that we learn in schools is actually British history. It's changing a bit now, but we're kind of going back to more cultural things. The language is resurging as well. But yeah, it's quite a similar situation. Again, all of the infrastructure was geared towards to the point of actually starving people in Ireland. All of the exports were coming over here to Britain, so yeah. So perspectives there.
So exactly. So you know, this thought experiment is for large parts of the world not a thought experiment, but for our students it's an experiment. It's like, ooh, I have to get my head around that. And so then the question is, well, suppose then that suddenly Britain regains its independence. How's it going to write British history? So what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to have a European history? What does it mean to have a British history? And how are you going to write it? So any thoughts on the challenges that you would face if you were then trying to write your history?
Well, often, for example, when a country is colonised, the records are damaged or destroyed.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. And where they do exist, they may well be in China. And who are going to be the existing experts on Chinese history? Sorry, on British history, I mean. There's going to be folk histories, but in the academy,
Chinese,
exactly. All of the experts in your history will be from outside. And as you say, then you're just left with the oral histories, which are interested in other things. They're interested in kings and queens and so the next example is what I actually deal with, which is the situation in Zimbabwe. So I work on Zimbabwe. Zimbabwean history doesn't work on kings and queens in the way that British history does. It certainly doesn't work on politics and government. It works on lineages and on spirits and on movements of people, and that's what the history is all about. So imagine if we had to write British history as if it were Zimbabwean history. And we would lose all of our king lines, and we would lose all of our great politicians and our development of our parliament and all those things, but instead we'd have histories about great clans and the movements of people across Europe and so on. So it would be a very different kind of history. And that would be correct history, although completely different from the oral history, the folk history that's just remembered somehow underneath. Is all of this making sense? Okay, so normally we'd get the students to discuss this much more amongst themselves, but we don't have time for that. And the point about this exercise is to get students to understand that when we say we need to provincialise Europe, that we're not just saying that to be goody-goodies. We're saying it because you can't actually understand the world properly if you don't understand the experience that the rest of the world has gone through in having its history marginalised and its identities marginalised. Is that making sense? So the point I'm finally leading towards is that we make the students, we invite the students to do that first. And then, I'm just checking that I get his name right, and he's actually a friend of Deana, so I could just ask Deana. But having made them do that thinking themselves, we then ask them to read an academic piece by Deepesh Chakrabarty called Provincialising Europe. But we don't ask them to read that first. We ask them to do the thinking first and try to internalise what it would feel like, and then do the reading by an Indian academic who's explaining the problems that the Indian Academy had in beginning to write its own history and centre its own history when everything was referring back to Europe. Does that all make sense? And it's only once they understand that need to change their perspective that we're not just saying it because this makes you better in some way, but because it produces better history if you are prepared to provincialise Europe. That make sense? Okay, back to Deana.
5 minutes, guys.
Sorry.
Okay.
That's not what it says up here. I was working on the clock up here.
We started late. We do only
Right.
have a few minutes. Well, I'll just give you an example then, because we don't really have time to do this exercise. So a key aspect then of this module, so we encourage this sort of critical thinking. We encourage students to think about their past in ways they haven't been expected to do or asked to do before. We find that students initially sit there like deer caught in headlights in the first initial lectures, and they're panicked and like, but you're not telling me how to think, but you're not telling me to answer a specific question. What we're actually asking them to do, our main form of assessment for this module, is a critical journal. So students choose the subjects about which they wish to write. They need to write about each of the, a number of the key themes in the module, and then they critically reflect upon the materials they've read. We also ask them to critically reflect on our own lectures. They have to talk about lectures in the journals. We want to see that they're there, they're engaged, and they're making connections, and also their seminar discussions. And we found this, we asked them to do this for the first time this year. We went, this is only our second time running the module, and we found a massive change in students' understanding because they're going to the lectures. And they're like, oh, I can see the connections between the lectures and what you're asking us to do for reading and watching and all these things. And the seminar discussions also. So we want them to reflect on all of that, and that also means reflecting on us, on the ideas we present them, and things we present them in seminar. And so one of the things, I was going to do a final exercise with you, which we're going to have to write. So
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Is they have to understand the language, the world view in which they've been enmeshed in order to start questioning it and thinking differently about the world. And so we talk a lot about the Enlightenment in the beginning of the module, and we have them do again some of these sorts of exercises. So I do one involving dogs and the natural history of the world, compiled by a chapter, the Comte de Buffon. And if you look at this, it's real stereotypes about dogs and their relationship to human and the individual standing in for the whole. And then I get them to think about this, and we talk about it, and then we then look at how these ideas get applied to human beings. Okay? And it's the exact same thinking. So again, the individual made to stand in for the whole, the individual has a disposition, a character, and of course, you know, in line with Enlightenment thinking, in which Europeans were placed at the top of the scale of civilization, then peoples in other parts of the world then, of course, get ranked according to those understandings. And so these are the sorts of things. We would pair this, however, in the actual assignment that students would do with contemporary sources. So they can actually see, well, how is this language being used today? How are people being stereotyped? How do we talk about peoples in other parts of the world? And then they get to think about that and reflect upon that and you know, and think about, well, yeah, why is this problematic and yeah, things like that. So that is the example I was going to talk to. Do you want to do a quick sum up?
Okay, I'm so sorry, Deana. As I say, I was working by how long we've been recording, which obviously we were running late. So yes, to sum up, what we're trying to do is to get students to use critical thinking. And we do that by challenging them to think in ways that they haven't thought before, but to ensure that they understand that we're asking them to do this to enhance their thinking, not because we think it's a moral good. And this is something they struggle with. So in the course of doing this, they learn to read a variety of primary materials critically. So materials like this, contemporary materials, materials like maths. We're asking them to read them critically and to understand why it matters, because it has a direct effect on the present. So we give them a set of critical analytical tools by inviting them first to think, with primary materials and other types of ways of thinking, and then to read, and then to reflect back. And then we ask them to use those critical analytical tools to begin to develop skills that are transferable. So the journal is a form of authentic assessment, the kinds of discussions that they're having to have, negotiations where they have different ideas, particularly those who want to push back, where they think we're saying everything you've learned is wrong, and they want to push back about that and say what's wrong with doing British history, and we get debates. So there's because we're dealing with awkward questions, we're also developing those debating and negotiation skills. So there's a whole range of transferable skills that they are then tested on through the journal, where we give them feedback on their use of those skills, far more than we give them feedback on whether they can churn back at us any content that we're throwing at them. Does that all make sense? Okay, thanks very much.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, guys.